Good evening and welcome to the webinar entitled Clinical Investigation in Vitro Diagnostic Devices. The aim of this webinar is to provide you useful insights on the requirements related to the clinical investigation and applicable to the in vitro diagnostic devices. During the webinar, we will ask you a few poll questions that you will see at the right side of your screen. Do not hesitate to answer. The aim of those questions is to get a better understanding of the participants, those of you. If you have questions during the presentation, you can directly write them in the chat screen, again at the right corner of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, Julian and myself we will try to answer to as much question as we can. If for the questions which were not answered during the webinar, do not hesitate to send us a mail after the webinar. So my name is Sylvia Angel. I'm a senior consultant at Mediday in charge of the in vitro diagnostic activities. Mediday is a company specialized in quality, regulatory, and clinical activities related to medical devices and also to in vitro diagnostic devices. Do not hesitate to go to our website if you would like to know more about Mediday or to contact Julian or myself after the webinar. You will have our email address. Julian is one of our experts in clinical activities and in vitro diagnostic devices. Julian has an extensive experience in the setup of clinical activities, clinical studies, and also the assessment and implementation of clinical evidence. Julian, the floor is yours.
Yes, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining in this webinar where we will talk about clinical investigation in relation with in vitro diagnostic devices. So in other words, we will talk about clinical performance studies and more precisely about the prerequisites for demonstrating compliance with the IVDR. So first of all, I guess you have all heard a lot about it and seen slides in this type already several times now, because the world of IVD devices is facing big change within Europe these upcoming months. So we, as a legal manufacturer, you will no longer have to be compliant with the directive, but with the in vitro diagnostic regulation, in other words, IVDR. So this regulation entered into force a few years ago in 2017 and will be now fully applicable within the upcoming year. So starting from May 2022, the last CE certificate under the IVDD can be delivered, and then from then on it's going to be under the regulation. Last valid certificate under the IVDD will expire in 2024, and then 1 year later all devices that will be placed on the market will need to be certified under the regulation. Now this brings quite a few changes for the manufacturers of IVD devices. There is a bit of a ticking bomb there because we need to get ready for this change within this regulatory framework. And here I would like, as part of this short presentation, highlight you two big changes which relate a bit to the topic that we are discussing today. So first of all, from the change from the directive towards the regulation, the manufacturer will no longer have to demonstrate compliance with the essential requirements, but with the general safety and performance requirements of Annex 1 of the IVDR. And will need as well to demonstrate demonstrate the performance of the device and do a performance evaluation for their IVD devices. So as part of this performance evaluation, the GSPR 1, 8, and 9 need to be addressed. And this is basically to demonstrate that the device achieves its intended performance, that it is safe and effective, that there is an acceptable risk-benefit ratio, that there is a minimized foreseeable risks and undesirable effects for these devices, and that the analytical and clinical performance of the device is achieved. So before, under the directive, the performance of a device already had to be addressed as part of the technical documentation, but I would say that now this is a way more formal requirement, and all of this performance evaluation needs to be documented formally within a performance evaluation report that is part of the technical documentation. And then another big change as well ahead is that the amount of devices under the IVDR which will need to be certified by notified body will drastically increase. So when we had beforehand potentially 80% self-certified devices, we will now have the opposite. So 80% of the devices will need to implicate a notified body for CE certification. Hence, the performance evaluation of the device, as well as the formal reports, will be assessed by notified bodies, and therefore the manufacturers need to really be prepared, have these documents ready to be able to demonstrate performance of the device as per requirements of the IVDR. Now, talking about the requirements of the IVDR when it comes to performance evaluation of the device, I would say that this clinical evidence as part of performance evaluation can be seen as a puzzle which contains 4 pieces. One is the scientific validity that needs to be addressed. Another one is the analytical performance, and there is the clinical performance and the post-market performance follow-up. Today, specifically, we're going to have a look at the clinical performance, as this is the main link towards with the topic we are discussing today. So what is actually clinical performance? So this is well defined within the IVDR under Article 2. So it refers to the ability of a device to yield results that are correlated with a particular clinical or physiological or pathological process or state in accordance with the target population and intended user. So this is really important to always consider that there is the intended use of the device there needs to be really well considered, as well as the target population. Especially now when we are talking about IVD tests which are for self-use, there the target population and the amount of or the type of study that you actually need to perform in order to demonstrate this clinical performance for this target population is going to be different than a test that is going to be used by healthcare professionals, for example. So there are as well within the IVDR now clearly listed several aspects which need to be demonstrated as part of this clinical performance. So these would be, for example, the diagnostic sensitivity of a test. So this is also sometimes called the true positive rate, which measures the proportion of positive results that are correctly identified. The diagnostic specificity, so this is the true negative rate, which measures the proportion of negatives that are correctly identified. The positive predictive value needs as well to be addressed, negative predictive value, or other performance criteria such as likelihood ratio or the expected value in a normal and affected populations. So now really the IVDR clearly states what type of activity needs to be or performed, or what type of requirements need to be fulfilled in terms of demonstrating clinical performance of an IVD device. Here to illustrate a little bit more into detail what are these. For example, when you take the test that is under evaluation, so on the left side of this slide, and you compare the test results with results obtained using a gold standard or a reference device, you will see that, for example, if here the column in red, if the gold standard gives you a positive result and your IVD test as well, these are called the true positives. False positives would then be in case the gold standard gives a negative test result, but your device identifies it as a positive, and then the ratio between true positive and false positive can then be used to calculate the positive predictive value, which is the probability that the subject with a positive screening test truly has the disease. A bit the same afterwards for the negative predictive value. I will not go more into detail, but here you see that it is important within a clinical performance study to have your test compared always to a reference gold standard IVD test, which is used and already acknowledged within the field, or a method actually other than a diagnostic, if this is not yet on the market, to actually, which is going to be the gold standard to correctly clinically characterize the subject. So when you do, when you have your device, you need, as mentioned before, to perform a performance evaluation on your device. So as part of this, you need to consider the device risk class, as well as its intended purpose and the claims which are made. As part of the process of performance evaluation, as a result, you will be able to clearly highlight the benefit-risk ratio of your device, to identify if there is a gap within your clinical performance data, and hence be able to see whether or not you actually need a study to close this gap and to have a complete performance evaluation that positively addresses your performance and safety of your device. So the performance evaluation is an ongoing process within the design and the development of your device. And as part of this, process, you are able to identify whether or not new clinical data are required. Once you have identified this, if there is a gap or not, based on the device intended purpose, the claims which are made, and, for example, state-of-the-art identified as part of your performance evaluation, you will be able to design your study that you will need to perform, and then afterwards conduct your study in order to feed back again the results of your study in the performance evaluation. So this is really an ongoing process within the entire life cycle of your device, and is the starting point to illustrate whether or not clinical data, more clinical data are actually needed. So what exactly is a clinical performance study? So this is defined under the ISO 20916. It's a study which is undertaken to establish or confirm the clinical performance of an in vitro diagnostic medical device. As a requirement as well from the IVDR, these studies, they need to be performed unless you can duly justify that you have sufficient clinical data in order not to, as a legal manufacturer, perform yourself a new clinical performance study. And as well, the results of such studies, they need to be documented within the clinical performance report. So here we're going to talk a bit as well about the legal requirements coming from the IVDR now, which is also something quite new with regard to the directive, where the regulation clearly states what are the basic requirements for the conduct of clinical performance studies. And here you will see I've tried to separate it a bit, because for IVD medical devices, it will clearly depend on the type of study and on what you will perform within this clinical performance study. So in other words, the IVDR under Article 57 lists all the general requirements regarding performance studies, and these general requirements, they are applicable to all clinical performance studies. Then afterwards, for certain type of studies, additional requirements need to be fulfilled. But the general requirements would, for example, apply to observational studies. We will then talk about what these type of studies really are. So observational studies which are performed using leftover or archived samples, and where there is no additional procedure involved within the clinical performance study, then the one which are usually performed for example, collection of the sample to be tested. So for these type of studies, you first need to demonstrate before starting such a study that you comply with all the relevant general safety and performance requirements of Annex 1 of the IVDR. Of course, apart from those that you as a legal manufacturer want to address within the scope of the clinical performance study. Also, it is really important that throughout the study, the health and the safety of the patient is always protected, as well as the health and safety of the user and other persons which are involved within the study itself. Such a study should always be performed within the similar circumstances as the normal condition of use of the device. This especially to be able to actually afterwards use the results as well to demonstrate performance and safety of your device. So as already mentioned before, if you have a device which is used for self-testing, you should try to mimic a bit conditions of self-testing in order for your data to be to have value to demonstrate performance of your device when used as intended. The right safety, dignity, and well-being of the study subject needs to prevail over the interests of the sponsor of the study, and the data that is generated, they need to be scientifically valid, reliable, and robust, because otherwise does not bother going and collecting data if in the end this data cannot be used for its purpose. And then one really important aspect, I think, for this type of study that it is that the law on data protection needs always to be taken into consideration. And this is especially a point that one needs to always think about when we think, okay, do we need to implicate an ethics committee in the approval of our study or not? Because protection of the data protection of the study participant is something that is also the concern of ethics committee. So it's always good, even for these type of studies, which need to fulfill maybe less requirements than the other, which put the subject also at lesser risk, to still get into contact with the ethics committee to see whether or not an approval for this type of study is needed or can be waived. And if, for example, you need to definitely have informed consent, or if this is also something that could be waived for this type of study. This needs to be discussed with the ethics committee beforehand. Then there are other type of studies which are clearly defined. There are 3 different categories here, which are the surgically invasive sample taking. So studies where, for example, you would need to draw blood from the subject. So it's surgically invasive. Then you have interventional studies. We will talk about what these type of studies are later on. And you have also studies where there is an additional invasive or a procedure or an additional risk to the study subject. So where, for example, there is no invasive sample taking, but you have to for X reason, for example, take an X-ray, an additional X-ray of the patient. So you put the study subject at high risk. So these fall under the category here, where additional requirements need to be fulfilled before you can start the conduct of such a study. So for these type of studies, you need, as well as a legal as a sponsor, and probably as well as a legal manufacturer of the device, fulfill with the Articles 59 to 77 of the IVDR, as well with Annex 14. These type of studies, you will need to have ethics committee review and approval before starting, and you will also need to have authorization from the competent authority of the member state where the study is being undertaken. So these are two aspects very important for these type of studies. Then other is that, of course, you need to protect vulnerable population. The benefits of the study, they need to justify the foreseeable risks. You need to obtain informed consent from the participants of these studies, as well the rights of the subject to physical and mental integrity, to privacy, and to protection of the data needs to be taken into consideration. Such study needs to involve as little pain, discomfort, fear, and any other foreseeable risk as possible. You need to involve the qualified medical doctor for all the medical care that is provided to the study participants. So you need to demonstrate that your medical doctor is qualified. The subject that need to be under no undue influence when participating in the study. Also, the biological safety testing has been conducted, and technical safety has been proven for these type of devices. Analytical performance has been demonstrated, and for interventional study as well, the scientific validity. The investigator as well needs to be qualified, and you need to demonstrate this. And the facilities used, they need to be as close as possible to the facilities of the intended use. So this is one category. Then we would have another category, which are CE-marked IVD medical devices, which are used as intended. So this would be PMPF studies. Here, the same type of activities need to be fulfilled, except for the fact that you don't need to go to have approval from the competent authority, but otherwise you still need to meet the basic requirements as well of the IVDR. Then, however, there is a next category as well. When you use a device which is CE marked, you use it as intended, but there is an additional burdensome procedure to the study participants. This type of study, they need to be notified to the competent authority at least 30 days prior to starting such a study. And there, for this notification, you will need to provide as well relevant documentation, which is referred in Annex 14 of the IVDR. Then one has, as a legal manufacturer of IVD medical devices, now you've certainly heard as well of the standard 20916, and you must be wondering, maybe, is this like a standard that I need to apply as part of a clinical performance study on my device? And here, in a few words, to explain, so for IVD medical devices, you have the regulatory requirements coming from the IVDR, and you need as well, as part of a clinical performance study, be able to demonstrate good clinical practice throughout the study. Now, whenever you plan, you design, you submit, you conduct, you record, and you report a study, and you do it in compliance with this ISO 20916 standard, this will allow you, will allow you to presume compliance as well towards the regulation and the good clinical practice. So yes, indeed, it is good to follow this ISO standard when conducting a clinical performance study, as it will be, if you comply with it, a demonstration that you fulfill the requirements of the IVDR. Now, if, for example, at a certain point, you should note that there is additional information within the regulation which is not stipulated yet in the standard, or if there is a small discrepancy where you're not sure which one should apply, it's always the IVDR which you should in the end take into consideration, or if the standard is more stringent, maybe go for the standard in this case. Now, you've maybe heard as well of the ISO 14155. This is the standard for the conduct of clinical investigation on medical devices. So IVDs are not within this scope. But however, if you have an integrated system where, for example, as part of your IVD system, you have within inside a lancet or a device like this, you need as well to fulfill like the requirements of the MDR for the medical device. And for certain aspects of the study, you would need as well to consider the standard on clinical investigation for medical devices. When we come to this ISO standard for clinical performance study, here a little bit an explanation on how the standard needs to be used, because it's a bit different than other standards which maybe one has seen so far, because there is a main body of the standard and there are several annexes. Now, to know whether or not you need to, these annexes apply to your study or not, you need to go through this little scheme where you ask yourself the question, is it an interventional study? If yes, you will need to fulfill all the requirements of the body of the document, plus Annex A, additional general requirements, the Annex B, which is on clinical performance study protocol, Annex C, which is investigation brochure, Annex D, which is clinical performance study report, Annex E, communication with the ethics committee, Annex F, informed consent. All these annexes need to be taken into consideration as well. And as well, the Annex J on adverse event categorization. This annex needs as well to be taken into consideration for any type of study that is performed, so as well for non-interventional studies where you use leftover or archived samples, where the requirements are a bit less stringent and where only the body part of the standard needs to be applied. Then as well, when talking about what type of standards are applicable when planning a clinical performance study. Here I would like to mention as well the ISO 14971, which is the standard on risk management, because now, as for all clinical investigation, there is a tight link between the clinical investigation and risk management. Indeed, you need to really demonstrate before conducting a clinical performance study that you have assessed all the risks which are associated with the participation of this study for the study subjects. These risks, they need to be documented within the clinical performance study protocol, and you need to be able to demonstrate that the risk to the subject, be it a direct or an indirect risk to the subject, they outweigh the benefits to the subject or to the society when there is no direct benefit to the subject participating in the study. So hence, all of this needs to be really taken into consideration before starting an investigation, clinical performance study, on how you can demonstrate that participating and the study, the benefits, they outweigh the risks. Risks, they can be of two sorts in a clinical performance study. They can be direct harms or indirect harms. Indirect harms could be, for example, during an interventional study. So these are two types of studies which could be considered. Interventional studies where the result of your test will actually lead to make a decision for the participant in the study. So a medical decision will be based on the test result of your IVD test. Hence here, if there could be like a direct, indirect, harm to the subject, because based on the test result, it could have led to wrong or like not the good medical care. Then you could have non-interventional or observational studies where basically the result of your test will not lead to the medical decision. And these can be afterwards cross-sectional or single time point design. Then they can, so just at a certain time point, you will compare, for example, your IVD to a gold standard. They can be longitudinal, where you have to take different samples throughout a time period to assess and compare your test result with the gold standard at several time points. It can be a retrospective design, where at a given time point you will assess data which have been already taken, or like samples that had been archived and medical decisions had already been taken, or you know the clinical outcome of the patient, and you in a retrospective study are going to see whether your device is able to match this the clinical outcome. You can have as well a prospective design where you're going to take new samples to which going to be needed for your clinical investigation, as well as a mix between prospective and retrospective design. So this is as well here illustrated a bit on the right. Based on what type of activities are performed, you will fall within a category, and it's really important before starting a clinical investigation to really assess what type of activity is needed to demonstrate performance and safety of your device. Is an interventional study really required, where the risks would be higher, or is it for you is it okay to have a non-interventional observational study? As part of a non-interventional study, is it sufficient for you to work with retrospective in a retrospective design, or do you need to have a prospective design to demonstrate performance of your device? So you really need to think about this before starting a clinical investigation and considering the design of your study. As already mentioned before, so the design of your clinical study needs to be tightly correlated with the intended purpose of your device. And it should be as well taken into consideration, is your device used for diagnosis? Is it used for screening purposes, for monitoring? And as well, what is the target population? Is it going to be a self-use test, or is it going to be used by professionals? This is all going to affect your clinical performance study design. As we can see here, for example, in this little table, whenever we consider diagnosis as an intended use, you will need to have way more data, or the requirement on your data will be more stringent, because it's going to be, in the end, as intended use, the sole purpose for diagnosis of a particular patient. When it's aid to diagnosis, you might maybe need less samples, because you need the results of your test is always be combined with other observations or other ways of assessing the patient. For screening as well, here, if you have a disease with a high prevalence, you will need maybe less samples than if you have a disease with low prevalence, where you need to think beforehand in order to have sufficient positive patients. I need to enroll a larger number of study. So it's really important as well to think beforehand of exactly what are you going to what are you needing to demonstrate as part of your performance evaluation in order to collect the correct clinical data, and as well to have the good statistical significance as well for its intended purpose. As well, when considering clinical study, a clinical performance study, you can think that maybe at the beginning you could have a pilot study, which is going to be first a small number of subjects. This could, for example, be used to confirm the scientific validity of your device. So you will have a first impression of the performance of your device. This pilot study will then be will allow you to maybe better design a pivotal study where you will have a predefined hypothesis with well-defined endpoints, well-defined enrollment exclusion criteria, and where you will collect sufficient data to demonstrate safety and performance of your device. And then a third type of activity is also the post-market performance follow-up studies, where once the device is already CE-marked and on the market, you as a manufacturer want to collect additional data on the device to close some potential gaps which are still remaining, or to assess rare safety related events or long-term outcome. So here a small difference indeed between a performance study and a PMPF study. So PMPF, whenever the device is already CE-marked, you will need usually to enroll the ethics committee to have their approval, or at least their waiver for approval. And whereas for performance study prior to CE marking, it depends then on the type of activity performed during the clinical performance study, whether you need competent authority approval as well. So in other words, like PMPF studies, they're like a specific form of a clinical performance study with sometimes less stringent requirements in terms of approval needed. Then once you have already thought about the design of your study, you will need to think what type of study sites can there be involved. So you need to recruit these sites. First, you need to qualify these based on the design or characteristic of the study and the intended use. You need to do a pre-visit study for site assessment and indeed qualify and your selected sites. And all of this process needs to be documented as well as part of the process of this clinical performance study. The main objective here in the site selection is the feasibility of the study. So you need to ask yourself the question whether is the investigator interested enough in participating, or will the motivation drop after a while and it's going to be difficult for you to motivate the investigator again. Are they willing to accept their responsibilities and obligations? Is the team competent? For example, are they GCP trained to participate in such a study? Is there going to be a high enough recruitment to have enough samples within a limited time period? And as well, how does the local ethics committee work? There needs to be, in the end, a written agreement between the sponsor and the study sites with regard to responsibilities and activities that are performed as part of the study. As well, when you start to include sites as part of your clinical performance study, I would recommend that it's really important to work closely with the investigator of these sites for the design of your clinical investigation for the performance study. and as well to help you draft the performance study plan in order for you indeed to have a study which in the end will be feasible. So to see how your study actually can be designed to fit best into the practice of the clinicians in these sites. So it's really important to discuss between sponsor and investigator for the design of the study and for the draft of the clinical performance study plan. The content of the clinical performance study plan, which needs to be drafted for any type of clinical performance study, is written in Annex 13 of the IVDR as well as in the standard. Here are a few aspects which need to be considered as part of such a clinical performance study plan. It's the stakeholders, like a description of the investigational device, what is going to be the gold standard used as part of the study, the inclusion-exclusion criteria, the design, justification of the design. So hence you need to really think about how you design your study. So several aspects that need to be considered as part of this clinical performance study plan. And as an investigator and as a sponsor, you then commit to executing the clinical performance study as documented within the plan. This is really important. Should there be amendments, this needs as well to be notified to the competent authority if competent authority was involved, as well as to ethics committee. So submission needs then to be performed, and this here we have already discussed. It depends on the type of study. We have already discussed this beforehand. You already need to as well really think about the monitoring activity, because the study needs to be monitored according to a plan, and this monitoring needs to be done by someone who is trained, who has knowledge in the field and is DCP certified. The monitoring activity will take place throughout the clinical performance study at several time points, and you have to do this based on a monitoring plan which is designed as through a risk-based approach. Safety reporting is as well to be considered for all type of clinical performance studies, where you need to consider the indirect as well as the direct harms to the to the subjects. And it is the duty of the sponsor to classify adverse events or that happen during the study, and to report these to the relevant either ethics committee or competent authority. So something which is documented as well in this Annex G of the ISO standard. Then when it comes to the end of the study, as a sponsor, you need to consider completing all the records, and then you need to as well notify the closure of your study to the competent authority, if applicable, and ethics committee, and this within 50 days after end of the performance study. And within 1 year after the end, you need to have written a formal performance study report, which illustrates what has been done. And here the content of such a report is as well documented in Annex D of the standard. So here to show that once you have performed all of this, the results of your study will feed back into the performance evaluation, and then as it is a continuous process, you will be able to identify, are there still remaining gaps? Do you need another study? Or do you now have all the gaps filled in terms of clinical performance data? So I'm sorry, I know I've been a bit running over the time. It's a very complex subject, and I think we could discuss it even during a longer period of time. So sorry about this. I hope you still all have a bit of time remaining for additional questions and answers, which we will gladly take.
Thank you, Julianne. Thank you for the presentation. So don't hesitate to write your question in the chat channel. I will have several questions, at least one question for you. Shall we all conduct PMPF studies, or when to conduct PMPF studies? Can you explain a bit this?
Yes, so it is a requirement as a part of the IVDR to perform PF activities as part after having placed your device on the market. Now, these PMPF activities can, if duly justified, be waived, but you really need to justify it. Now, PMPF activities can be all sorts of activities. They don't need to be really a clinical performance study. It can be a different type of follow-up of clinical performance, but you need to duly justify if you don't perform such activities. And then whether or not it's going to be a clinical performance study or not will depend really on the clinical data that you have already available. And if there is a need to further assess certain aspects of your device once placed on the market.
Thank you, Julianne. A question related to the country-specific registration, and also, is there any better country to conduct the clinical studies? Are the requirements in terms of registration of clinical studies different from a country to another?
So currently, there might be still a little bit of a difference between different countries in terms of application for the performance of a clinical performance study. At the current status, it is important as a sponsor to go and see what are the requirements of a given country. This should then be unified with time once EUDAMED is in place and where the registration is going to be more centralized. So I would say currently, yes, there might be a difference between countries, though they should currently already apply the IVDR requirements, but there might still be some slight differences. Afterwards, it's going to be centralized via EUDAMED, and then it should not make a difference anymore.
And what about multicentric studies? How we are managing that?
For multicentric studies, so this is a bit different for IVD medical devices, where you don't need to list as part of your study plan what type of studies are actually going to participate, but you need to have a list ready, or like a list where you cite all the different study sites which have participated in your clinical performance study. Of course, the sites need to be qualified and the personnel working there need to be GCP trained as well. This you have to demonstrate, but it's not, it's different than for a clinical investigation on a medical device where you really need to cite all the sites participating in the study already directly within your clinical investigation protocol plan.
And last question, is it mandatory to conduct clinical studies with the same population as the population to which you apply the CE mark?
So you need to collect relevant data for your device, so data which will be able to demonstrate performance and safety of the device when used as intended. Hence, when used as intended means as well a certain type of population. So you need to really address consider the type of population which will allow you to demonstrate performance and safety of the device when used as intended. So yes, you need as well to, if it is for diagnosis, you need to consider as well population which is considered positive, but as well negative population, in order to really see, do you have false negative, do you have false positives? It's really important to consider in this case both. But you need to, with inclusion exclusion criteria, you can fine tune based on really the type of the intended use of your device.
Thank you, Julianne. Thank you for answering to all those questions. And thank you very much to all the participants to this webinar. We are really looking forward to have your feedback on this webinar by mail to Julianne or myself. Julian just showed a slide with our future training, and we are also planning to have 2 intensive training, one on the performance evaluation, a half-a-day training, as well as on the same topic as today, clinical investigation, a more in-depth training based on also sample of examples and also some exercises. So do not hesitate to answer to our poll related to the fact that you would like or not to participate to this type of trainings. Thank you very much for your attention, and hope to have some feedbacks from you in the future days.
Thank you very much to everyone, and I'm sorry again for taking a bit longer than what was initially planned.